welcome to Darisimi Makinde,
Thank you.
who is a games designer
Yes.
and is going to tell us all about games design, which I'm looking forward to. So, so let's start with how you got into game design and why, I guess.
Sure. So I suppose I knew I wanted to get into game design at a pretty young age. I was about 11 years old when I played an online RPG. And what really attracted me, I played games all the time, but what attracted me about this particular game was that it was very accessible. So I could play it on my school computer, which was great for me. So I didn't have a games console, didn't have a PlayStation, any stuff like that. So I'd play it at my school during my lunch breaks. And what I found particularly interesting about this game was that the guy who developed this game, the designer of this game, he would blog about it, and he would always blog about the decisions he made and why he made them. And that was interesting to me because it got me thinking not just about games I enjoyed playing, but I actually got some insight into the mind of the person who made it. And it made me realize, oh, he thought about these things. The characters of these colors and the attacks make these noises and these graphics look a certain way because of these particular decisions that led to it. And then what really blew my mind was that he would talk about the software he used to make these games. And I realized that that software existed on my school laptop. It was a software package called Macromedia Flash. I think it's since been bought by Adobe. So you know it as Adobe Flash now. But back then, Macromedia Flash existed on my school laptop. And I thought, do I just need to open the software package up and then I can just do what he does? And obviously it was nowhere near that simple, but it got me thinking, and it gave me I would try things out. Whenever he would release an update to his game, I would try and copy that in my own version on my school laptop. And I would eventually, it took me through a weird way, because eventually I would make websites first, because I used to make these animated websites, because for me that was a lot simpler. It was the idea of like making these complex animations and tying it to a degree of programming, but purely to access web material. I wasn't quite ready to develop games yet. But when I got a mastery of that, and I'd actually make a few websites for a few people to get better at it, I eventually thought if I could use it on programming and then apply these person's design principles, I could eventually turn it into video games. And my ICT teacher took notice. And what he started doing was he would set me extra homework to try and refine that ability. And so I would do my schoolwork, but alongside that, I'd also do these extra tasks that would be like, can you program a gun? Can you get the gun to fire in a certain way? Can you program a Mario platform and get Mario to jump a certain height? Just things like that. And because of that, I just became this massive nerd. So over my lunch breaks, I would just be doing this rather than going out and playing. And in fast forward a few years, I eventually go to sixth form. In sixth form, I did art, ICT, and English Lit. And then I transferred that over to my degree, which is in computer science and software engineering. In the University of Westminster, they just called it computer game development to make it more attractive. But it was essentially computer science and software engineering with a bit of art and graphics on the side. So I did that. It was a 3-year undergrad degree, which I was glad to say I passed with a first class degree. And from there, I would just send my CV out. It got to the point where I just found this website full of all the game studios in the UK, and I just emailed all of them and sent my CVs. I didn't care where I ended up. But fortunately, I ended up in London, so it's not like I had to do that or anything. And yeah, I mean, I appreciate making a long story short a bit, but yes, through that process, I got my first job as a junior game designer. I worked in that job for about a year, then I got promoted into a general game designer. And I worked there for another 2 years before now I work at King as a technical designer, where I currently work on Candy Crush franchise.
Okay. So just to go back a bit, you mentioned a teacher sort of spotting that interest in games design and giving you that extra work to do. How important do you think that was in your sort of development?
That was massively important, I'd say. To the extent where I would almost attribute my success solely to that teacher. And I say that because in sixth form, as much as I enjoyed it, I just kind of drifted through. It was one of those things where I just did it for the UCAS points. But when I got to university and started my degree, it was uncanny how similar the degree was to the work my teacher set me, to the point where I just breezed through my first year without really thinking about it because I've done all this stuff already. And it was purely because my teacher saw that I was interested and decided to just invest a bit more time in me. And I think that encouragement was hugely important. And another reason why it was important is because amongst my peers, I wasn't really encouraged to do stuff like this. I think there's the elephant in the room is for a lot of people like me, for a lot of Black people, the assumption is that you'll go into music or sports, and that's a stereotype reinforced by society, but unfortunately also reinforced by peers, to the point where I was often bullied or made fun of for being that kid who was at lunch, spending his lunch break on a computer. But again, my teacher was like, "No, you're good at this. Carry on. Like, if you like it, why stop?" And again, he said me what to do, and it was genuinely fun. Genuinely enjoyed it, and he made me realize, could I get paid to do this? Could I do this for a living? Maybe I can. So I'd say education, being recognized by the right people, and being placed in the right areas is massively important.
Yeah, it is so important. Yeah, and as you mentioned, sort of your peers as well. Not, where you don't have the support of your peers for something you want to do, having that extra support from your teacher, or it could be a family member or someone else, is really important as well.
Yeah, I should say, actually, to be fair to my family, they were also very supportive too. My parents, it took some convincing, my parents, mostly because, they came to the UK from Nigeria. They obviously wanted me and my sister to do very well. They had a particular idea, for them is either politics or being a doctor or being a lawyer, which makes sense, especially considering their backgrounds and what they've seen. But for them, what eventually convinced them was, my parents got to the point was, we just want you to study. We just want you to at least apply yourself to something. It's not necessarily about being a lawyer or a doctor. We just want to make sure that whatever you want to do, you actually work hard for it. And as long as you do that, then we're happy. And so that's kind of what convinced them to allow me to pursue a career in games.
That's fantastic. So moving on from that, so you went from junior designer to technical designer. So just explain the difference and how you sort of moved forward in that.
Yeah, absolutely. Career. Sure. So, the degree I did at the University of Westminster was very much engineering focused in terms of you were doing lots of physics, maths, programming, computer science, data structures, things like that. However, personally speaking, I also had quite a big interest in the more artistic side of games. And I don't necessarily mean in terms of being an artist, but more about thinking about the concepts behind games, like the ideas behind them and the story behind those games. As I'm sure you've seen in many modern games, they are very cinematic in the way they're presented. So I had this weird kind of almost diametrically opposed interests where I wanted to be an engineer, but I also wanted to design. And by design, I mean create levels or create stories or create characters. So I carried on with my degree in engineering, but also taught myself design skills. And that's how I kind of got my job as a designer. And in that design role, I was mostly just writing documents to explain how the game works to other people who then implement these ideas. But I didn't want to waste my engineering background. So I eventually found ways to kind of marry those two things. So I've kind of carved a niche for myself at King, where I'm currently at. And in that niche, I am operating as a designer, but I'm labeled a technical designer because not only am I responsible for how games look and feel, in the case of Candy Crush, how the levels play out, but I'm also responsible for the programming behind those levels. So things like, what tools do our designers use to make those levels more interesting, or how can we figure out ways to get data from our players in a legal way, of course, to figure out how they play, what they find fun, what they find difficult, and how can we leverage that information to then make our games more fun.
Okay. Yeah, sounds fascinating, and it seems to come back from that sort of early spark that you got into.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, I see. There's more. He thinks about the colours, the interactivity. So it's interesting how that sort of then comes to fruition much later. So take us through the sort of process of designing a game. What does that look like?
Oh, that sounds like asking.
It's probably a big question, right?
You know what I'll do? I'll answer it in terms of my specific impact, because a design is a very broad field. And in fact, I'll give you a brief overview before I go into what I do. So being a game designer can mean 100 different things, depending on where you're working and the game you're working on. If you're working on a game like Candy Crush, for instance, Candy Crush is what we call a live game, and by which you mean it's a game that doesn't end, so to speak. Every 2 weeks we'll add more levels, and that's what keeps our players engaged. However, when you have a game like, say, Ghost of Tsushima, a game that just came out, a game like that, it has a definite ending. So designing a game like that, you're talking about what's the beginning, what's the middle, what's the end, what keeps players engaged throughout the entire process. But we're not too fussed about players quitting the game when they're done, because They finish a bit, they put the game down, and move on to another game. Whereas at Candy Crush, we want you to ideally keep playing indefinitely because we keep producing content. So we have designers who monitor those things. We also have designers who specifically work on narrative. If a game is very story heavy, a game like Mass Effect is a great example. That game is praised for its really engaging story. But then you have other games like we have online games like World of Warcraft or EVE Online. So designers on those games are going to talk more about the economy. So if anything, you're actually more of an economist than a designer, because in an online game, you have virtual currencies. And that currency, like in the real world, is the very basis of how people interact with each other. So you need to get the currency right, because without that, things will feel completely unbalanced and therefore not fun. So there's so many things to consider. What I currently do on Candy Crush is I'm what's called a technical level designer. So my process, so to speak, is we plan what's called an episode. And by episode, we mean a group of about 15 to 20 levels, depending on what exact game I'm working on at the time. And what we do there is we want to think about what is the player's journey while playing through those batch of 15 to 20 levels. Should it be completely difficult? Should it be too easy? What pattern do we want? How many easy levels do we want? How many hard levels do we want? And why? Once we come to that decision, we then start to think about how varied do we want these levels to be. Obviously, you don't want too many of the same kinds of levels being played in a row, because that gets boring, it gets too predictable. But at the same time, you don't want to blindside our players with completely different level types, because you want them to kind of get used to a certain way of playing so they know what to expect to a degree. And then they can get pleasantly surprised by when you throw a curveball their way. So we, as a team, we'll spend about maybe a day deciding what we want to do with that journey. And then we'll begin. And at that point, we'll split the responsibility up. I can't give definite team sizes because we can't give away company secrets. But we'll have a team of a bunch of people, and we'll split those levels out between those people. And they will then begin quite literally using the software that I usually create to make those levels. And then once those levels have been created, we'll spend a day playing through those levels. We'll actually play them ourselves and ask ourselves, how do these levels feel? Like, are they actually fun? Often we have an idea about how they should feel, but once we play it, we're like, no, this doesn't really work. This is boring, or this is too easy, or this is way too hard. Players will quit if they play this game. So we'll give each other feedback and spend another day working on that feedback. And then after about another 2 or 3 days of that process, we will run it through a sanity checker where we just make sure that nothing's broken. We'll then ship those levels out to our players, and then we'll spend about 2 weeks gathering data. And like I said before, this is very unintrusive data. This is purely things like how many players are winning, how many players are losing, how many players are quitting, how many players are getting stuck, things like that. So we don't know anything personally identifiable. I wouldn't be able to say, oh, this is a middle-aged female player from the United Kingdom. I wouldn't be able to say that, but I will be able to say this player playing on an iPhone 5 keeps crashing. Maybe there's a bug, and maybe there's something that we need to look at. So we'll get all that data back, and this is usually when we realize a lot of our assumptions were wrong. So we'll have to use that data to then iterate. And then again, this will mostly be my job at this point as a technical designer. I'll then gather this data, disseminate it in a way that the other designers can understand. We'll then work on that feedback and then re-release those levels out. And then we'll just keep this process going on. And then we do the whole thing again about 2 weeks later.
So obviously audio is part of what I do as well. And
yeah.
How does it work with you? So, because I know it's vastly different than, say, working on a movie where there's like a set length of sort of levels and there's chunks of audio. How does it work with music and audio?
So it's interesting to say that it's different to movies, and that's not strictly true depending on the type of game we're working on. Especially recently, with how powerful like PlayStation and Xbox consoles in particular are becoming, they can handle much more cinematic sound, to the point where we often treat these things like movie projects. That said, that's not very true in what I do, because obviously I work on mobile games. So in that regard, our interaction with audio tends to be a lot more limited, depending on if we're making levels, for instance, the sound effects are already predefined, they've already been outlined. However, where we start to commission new audio, it tends to be when we add new areas or new things to interact with. So again, using Candy Crush in particular, because that's the freshest in my mind right now. We often do what's called a blocker or an obstacle, and we have new obstacles every 100 or so levels. I'm just throwing a number out there as a representative example. And when we add those new obstacles, we then need to talk about what are these obstacles meant to represent? Is it meant to feel bubbly, chocolatey, squishy, things like that? And as a result, we often get like a mood board of feelings. So how do we feel when looking at these graphics? And then we often then at that point, we'll commission sound effects. So we have a whole team devoted to sound. It's not a team that I interact with personally on a day-by-day basis, but they are there, and it's their job purely. And there are other jobs in the games industry that have a much closer relationship with them. But I can say that we've learned our lessons. In fact, I can talk more about my first job. So I would say a mistake in our first job was not considering sound enough. One of our big mistakes was we would almost create a game in its entirety and then think about sound effects. And that was a huge mistake. It's something that we realized was really bad, because the thing is, we realized that sound and visuals are intrinsically linked. So you can't develop the visuals without thinking about the sound, but we did that initially. So when we spoke to our sound engineers, one that we hired in, they were like, look, the descriptions you're saying, they make sense, but I don't think it matches up with what you're looking at. And I can develop a sound I think will work for you, but really should have included us from the start. And we took that on board. So in our future projects, we got sound engineers way early on, and our players were much more appreciative. Speaking frankly, we made a lot more money because sound and visuals are important. But also, as designers and as developers, we were just happier. And of course, sound engineers were happier too, because we weren't treating them as second-class citizens. They were there from the very beginning of the process. Now, this is a lesson King learned a long time ago, so in my current job, so it wasn't as big of a revelation to them. So to them, like I said, we have a sound department, and whenever we make a new project, we include our sound designers at the very beginning to make sure that they have their say and they make sure things work the way they should.
So in general, because I know you can't sort of go into specifics, but like, what kind of things are you having to discuss with your sound team?
So we mostly talk about, we go into very specific sound bites. So we say like, how many sound effects per thing do we want? Because obviously what helps our artists a lot is talking about the different stages of animation. So if, for example, we have like a character, how many movements does that character make? How many stances does that character have? How many states can that character be in? And then, for example, I'm going to use a fighting game from some, let's say Mortal Kombat, for instance. So a Mortal Kombat character has several states of being. They have healthy, injured, nearly dead. And within those states, there are several different states. Like, what are they like when they attack? What are they like when they are attacked themselves? What are they like halfway through an animation? So we have all these, we have like literal spreadsheets full of different character states. And because of that, we can quite definitively say we need X amount of sound effects. So that really helps the sound guys. So at least they have in their head, how long am I going to be on this project for? So once we define that, we'll go into what are those various states actually like, and what are the transitions between those states. So for example, if a character goes from healthy to injured, what is that transition like, and therefore how many sound effects do we need for that? And then again, sound effects guys are like, great, at least we have an idea of how many things we're working with. Then after all those very technical definitions, then go into, okay, how's this going to feel? How should players feel when they hear it? Should they wince? Should they cheer? Should they laugh? Things like that. And then again, that helps us get a feel for how the players are. And then on top of that, we have lots of player testing as well. Like with Candy Crush, I can say that we do tend to bring potential players into our studios and then say like, have a play with these different builds. So by build, I mean like versions of the game. So have a play with these game versions. All of these we won't tell them they have different sound effects. We'll just say, here are different games. Which one feels right to you? And they'll say this one because it just sounds right. So they say stuff like that all the time. So yeah, does that answer your question, or did I kind of veer off the topic of it?
No, that's fine. No, that was good. So how long does that process take then, sort of working with the sound department?
That's a tough one because I say on average, it spans the entire development of the game. So like I said, in my first job, we will give our sound guys like a month to come up with their sound effects, but that was a mistake. So I'd say really it's tied down to the game development itself. So it's not, I can't really give you a helpful answer because it's tied to how long the game itself takes to make. So for example, if a game takes 2 years to make, the sound takes 2 years to make. The sound designers are included in that entire process. If we can make a game in 6 weeks, then again, the sound will also be made in 6 weeks because it's down to the game development.
Right, yeah, because it's going to be a constant backwards and forwards,
Exactly.
developing the sound and the visuals.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in terms of like sometimes we'll commission something and we'll get something back within a week, but that doesn't mean it's finished. It just means they've given us something, and then we'll feedback, and then we'll give it back to them, and they'll give it back to us. So I guess in terms of like how long does it take to ask for a sound effect and get one back? In that case, about a week, but we wouldn't call that finished. That's just like that's the beginning of our relationship with these people.
Right. Okay. Oh, that makes sense. Okay. So for someone that wanted to go into sort of game design, into what you're doing, what advice would you give somebody?
Really good question. So game design in general, as much as I enjoy it, it is one of the hardest parts of the games industry to get into. And again, just for context, there are other jobs within the games industry. There is music, there is programming, there's engineering, there is art, there is production, there's UI, there's UX. So there's a lot of fields to do. If you want to get into games, there's a job for you no matter what. But design specifically, because that's what I do, design is hard for a simple reason, which is it's not clearly defined what a game designer needs to be like. Like game designers are very different people. Talk to two different game designers, you'll get two very different personalities. I, for instance, I'm very technically minded. You'll get designers who are very artistically minded, and in that case, it'll work for their projects. You'll get a designer who's very business minded, and again, it'll work for their projects. So it is hard in that regard. But that said, I can give you some general advice, which is, as funny as it sounds, play loads of games, like play a lot, but think about it from a more analytical standpoint. So, which I guess is kind of a pro and con of being a game designer. I can't really enjoy games anymore because I'm always thinking about them analytically. I imagine you're the same way as sound. Like you hear sound effects in a movie, and you're no longer thinking about, oh, that sounds realistic. You're thinking about, oh, right, was that the right way? Did they do it the right way? Oh, I can tell they made that mistake. That type of thing.
It can be. I find, like on the first watch, I'm okay. I can normally watch it. I find if it's not a great movie, then I will instantly start pulling out. Okay, what are they doing here? Because I don't really care about the story so much anymore. It can happen. Yeah,
for real. But yeah, I would say honestly, playing games and playing a variety of games is a great way. Because I mean, if you go in for an interview as a designer, one of the questions I'll ask you is what makes a game good. And you need to know an answer to that question. Like, and I'll say, what makes a game bad? I'll say, can you give me an example of a good game and tell me why it's good? Can you give me an example of a bad game and tell me why it's bad and what you would do to make it good? That type of thing. So in that regard, just playing loads of games will give you an idea. So you'll be like, why are you enjoying this game? What do you enjoy about it? Are you not enjoying this game? What don't you enjoy about it? If you could change something about this game, what would you change? Things like that. There's also loads of blogs you can read. So there's this place, I mean, again, the title's a bit weird, but there's a blog called Deconstruction of Fun. So they're literally trying to deconstruct fun behind games, but it's a great resource. And what they do is, it's a completely free resource, by the way. And it's basically an online blog series where various industry professionals will just say, I'm going to pick this game and I'm going to deconstruct it, talk about what works and what works about it, what doesn't work about it. Reading that, like that helps me through university, and like quoting articles from there helped me get my first job, actually. Like just because they knew that I was engaged in the industry, they knew that I was actually trying to think about these things. So yeah, playing games, reading about games, trying to make games yourself. And I know that also sounds very daunting, but honestly, there's never been a better time to try and do it on your own, in terms of like at least opening up a program and just trying to make your own prototype. I'm not saying you can make your own Uncharted game on your own, but what you can do is prove how games work mechanically. Because all the game is, when you break it down, it's just a bunch of features, a bunch of ideas. And if you can refine those ideas, it doesn't matter how good or bad they are, but it's the idea that makes the game fun. You can have a very good-looking game that just isn't very fun to play. And all you need to do is take one look at the box office, or the equivalent box offices like Metacritic or Rotten Tomatoes for games, and you'll see that there are games that look amazing, but they're just not fun. Like, I mean, not to call people out, but this is very public knowledge, but a game called Anthem by BioWare, for instance. Again, I love those guys. I'm a huge fan of theirs, but Anthem was a game that looked beautiful, but it reviewed terribly, to the extent where they're actually considering redesigning the game from the ground up. And looking at that game, you can see, like, you'll watch an advert for it and say, this looks amazing. And you'll play it and you're like, I'm not enjoying this. And then again, like, when it comes to that, you be like, why am I not enjoying it? And then, okay, let's look at other games because they're a good company. Okay, this game doesn't look as nice, but it has these features, and that's why it's fun. So just knowing that type of thing. But to jump back into developing games on your own for a second, the reason why there's never been a better time is because there are software packages like Flash. But things when I was in school, my school had Flash because Flash cost hundreds of pounds. So there's no way you're going to get that without a school to support it. But nowadays, there's software packages like Unity or the Unreal Development Kit, which are completely free, like no strings attached. So what you can do is you can download those pieces of software and just go on YouTube and look up tutorials for how to run games on it. And again, I did that in uni as well. I went to a game competition and they were using this engine I'd never touched before. So I was like, I need to learn how to use this fast. So I downloaded it and I just went onto YouTube and said, how do I make a platform game? So again, like how do I make a game like Mario using the Unity engine? And it'll be a video going, hey guys, I'm going to teach you how to make Mario on Unity. Here's step 1, here's step 2. So just things like that. And then when you learn stuff like that, those very basic things, you then start to think about, okay, now that I know how to do these basics, how can I change it? What can I do to make it my own? What if I was to make a game like Mario, but instead you jump twice as high? What if I was to make a game like Mario, but instead of the Mushroom Kingdom, you're in a Forest Kingdom? And then soon you start changing things out and tweaking things. And before you know it, you've got your own game. And that can go in your portfolio. And again, prospective employers can look at it and say, well, obviously it's not amazing, but you did all that on your own. And it shows a good grasp of knowledge. And doing that, you're like, okay, we're willing to take you on at the very least on an intern basis.
That is fantastic advice, actually. So to jump to audio again, so for you working with someone in audio, what kind of person, would you require? What what kind of person do you enjoy working with as far as getting your audio from that person?
So, I mean, the question about audio, this can apply to anyone I work with, really. Humble people, people who are willing to take on feedback, people who are willing to take on negative feedback as well, because when it comes to games, it is about we tend to have a very high quality standard, and that's because our players expect that from us. Players will not play a game that they don't enjoy, and as a result, we have to be ruthless, and it means we need to be willing to scrap ideas very quickly, and that goes for everyone. Like I've worked on games for like 3 years that we've ended up cancelling and that's 3 years of your life that players will never see the light of day. But like, well, if you released that game, it would have done terribly. So we need to understand and cut it back. So yeah, working with humble people who can take that feedback on is a real positive. When it comes to games as well, working with gamers for me is nice. Obviously, you don't have to be a gamer to work in the games industry, but for me to say, hey, have you played Street Fighter? I want something a bit like that. Like that, having that frame of reference is really interesting as well, and again, really helpful. But at the same time, what I also appreciate is someone who I can bounce ideas from. So again, there's this misnomer from people outside of the industry thinking that a game designer comes up with all the ideas. Not true. A game designer is someone who can collaborate and collate ideas and make them codified. That's true. But it is everyone coming up with ideas. It's a very collaborative process. And as a result, someone who's willing to suggest things and actually make their voice heard is very much a positive as well for sound engineers, but for everyone too.
Because you mentioned actually before, there are games which are quite cinematic, where there have been sort of big name composers actually that have come on board to sort of do the music for the games as well.
Yeah.
So there is still, I guess, there is an opening for people that may have an interest in games but may not be expert in games to still provide music.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't want to tell people that you must be a die-hard gamer to work in the games industry. Obviously, having a die-hard passion for something will definitely make you more attractive. And again, and we're willing to forgive people who are not as skilled if the passion is there. But that said, if we've got several people who have transitioned into the games industry who had no interest were suddenly very much interested, and they become gamers that way, and that's fine too. And especially with music. So the big games like The Last of Us 2 that just came out, one of the things people talk about the most apart from the story is the music. And again, Final Fantasy, one of the longest running JRPG franchises, has been going on since before I was born. Again, what people love, like you will hear the music and it just takes you right back. Like music is so important in that regard. And of course sound too, because with World of Warcraft, like there's a certain sound effect. Whenever a character levels up, there's this really memorable noise, and you can just play that sound, and people are like, World of Warcraft. Like, it's that type of thing.
And for the music, are they brought in similarly at the beginning, and then you're working with them throughout the process?
The best games have that. So I can't speak for every single studio, but the ones that do the best in terms of music have musicians there from the very beginning.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Coming from what you were saying about the sound effects as well.
Yeah.
Well, this has been fascinating. I feel like I need to go and buy a games console and get some stuff happening and up my game, literally. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for speaking to me, Darisimi. It was fantastic. Great.
No worries, man. You take care.